everybody.
Hi.
It's Maya and Anjum,
Hello.
not live from New York, on a Friday night. We just wrapped up our first week at UNCSW, and the theme for this year was social protection. So any initial highlights or pieces that you got from the panels or the workshops that you were at?
Yeah, so I was on many different sessions here at United Nations. There's side events and parallel sessions, which was great because we got both the government perspective and also the civil society perspective. And what we were realizing is that for social protection policies like equal pay, like employment insurance, like public services like healthcare, no one across the world has really nailed it down on what it means to be gender responsive, but there's some best practices and emerging practices. Think about equal pay in Iceland, for example, gender responsive budgeting in many of different countries around the world. So there's a lot that Canada can learn, and also Canada also demonstrated their ability to be a leader in this space because as a country at the forefront of these issues in North America but globally, we were also sharing some of our best lessons learned as well.
So I was lucky enough this year to get selected to be a part of the official Canadian delegation, and it was really interesting because this is the year that Canada is actually running for a seat on the Security Council to position ourselves as a country sort of being a middle power and a peacemaker at a time of a lot of global instability and volatility. So that was really interesting. But I think what I learned over this past week, there were hundreds of meetings. I had a major case of FOMO because every time I was at one workshop or one training, there was 3 other panels I wanted to be at. But being part of the negotiations, it was really interesting to see how different countries had different positions on gender-based violence and gender policies. I think for us at YWCA there were really 2 things. We were pushing for inclusion around specific language supporting Indigenous women, decolonization and indigenization throughout the entire week, number 1. And number 2, at all of the panels, I was really clear around pushing for intersectionality, that just because we're talking about gender-based budgeting or gender-based housing, that not all women experience social infrastructure the same way. So especially for Indigenous women, Black women, newcomer women, women of color, women living with disabilities, our experiences are a little bit different. So the policies and the programs need to look different. Any other interesting good practices that you found in your workshops or in your panels?
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was around how different countries around the world are addressing public services and ensuring that they are gender responsive. Sri Lanka, for example, was starting to see how universal healthcare coverage is not only good for the health and well-being of their population, it actually closes the gap on gender equality and gender equity issues. Because when women actually have access to public services they need free of cost, that actually ensures that they can use that money for other services and other things that they need. So that was one of the best practices that I saw. Another was in Finland, for example. They have really been pushing the equal pay legislation. And so in Canada, we just pushed for proactive pay equity legislation as well. So it'll be interesting to learn from our colleagues around the world about how to do that policy better. Another piece that I thought was really interesting was parental leave policies by Nordic countries. And so they are really using that as a tool for gender equity and gender inclusion because they're requiring all parents to really use that type of policy to lower the burden of work, not only a professional work, but also domestic labor as well in the home. And so they actually had a session where they're talking about different Nordic solutions. And what was interesting is that they also had same-sex provision. So it's not that it has to be necessarily a heterosexual couple. They actually were looking at it from an LGBTQ lens as well, which I thought was promising.
I think one of the things I found so interesting is out of the 10,000 people here at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, there's 5,000 from what they call CSOs or civil society organizations. So YWCA Canada was here as a not-for-profit and as a charity, but sometimes there was real tensions between governments and not-for-profit organizations, advocates like ourselves. So I was in one particular panel where there was a member of parliament from Ghana. And things got really spicy when he started misquoting his country's statistics on lack of access to safe abortions and misquoting statistics on precarious work. And some of the Ghanaian activists basically called him out in the meeting and decided to take over the panel. So it was definitely one of the best panels I was on, because then other continental African and European women started cheering them on, challenging this male member of parliament for not doing his homework, questioning the fact that there were actually women in the room who had the expertise and the right knowledge. Then they started high-fiving each other, took the panel away from the member of parliament, and then the entire session ended with a group photo. So it was definitely a really interesting example of what happens when women come together, and also when we have our own space and our own power and our own voice. So for those of you who couldn't join us this year, we're hoping to find other ways of getting the information out to you, and thank you so much for joining us from home.